Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. We have one of our special episodes today, Going Tudor, with Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scots. And joining us is a wonderful historian who I'm really excited to talk to, Linda Porter, who is critically acclaimed best-selling author of 6 books on the Tudors and Stuarts. She has a DPhil in history from the University of York. Linda reviews regularly for the Literary Review and BBC History Magazine, and frequently appears on TV talking about Mary Queen of Scots, Charles I, Henry VIII's wives, and Charles II's mistresses. She was the historical consultant for Lucy Worsley's BBC TV series, 6 Wives, and BBC's The Boleyns, A Scandalous Family. And her recent book, and for some reason I cannot remember the title, Linda, even though I've read it.
It's called The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor.
I knew there was thistle in there. I have read it. It's excellent. So hello, Linda. Welcome to A Slice of Medieval, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and I'm delighted to be with you.
So I suppose we'd better let you tell us who exactly was Margaret Tudor and what was her early life like.
Margaret Tudor was the eldest daughter and second child of Henry VII and his wife Elizabeth of York. She was born in late November 1489 and christened almost immediately afterwards, as were children who were, it was hoped that they would survive in those days, all wrapped up against the cold of an early English winter. And her early childhood was an extraordinarily pleasant one. She grew up, of course, not at court with her parents, because, as you well know, throughout the ages, royal children did not grow up in the company of their parents, though they, depending on the monarch themselves. And in this case, Margaret saw certainly her mother quite frequently, and her father also from time to time. And the parents' marriage was a very happy one. Elizabeth and Henry were indulgent and interested parents, perhaps much more affectionate in the sense that we would understand a modern family than was generally the case for monarchies throughout Western Europe in that time. And Margaret grew up basically in what is now southeast London, in Richmond. Well, I suppose Richmond's southwest London, come to think of it, but at least southern London, in Richmond and at Eltham Palace. Richmond was extensively rebuilt in the late 1490s after a disastrous fire there when the family were actually in residence. So the Richmond as it became was not the one that Margaret had known as a very small child. But Eltham, of course, was an old palace going back into the Middle Ages. And it was generally thought that those kind of places near to but outside London were more healthy for royal children. And the air was better there. There was nice countryside. They could go for walks. They could learn to ride. All the attributes which were expected of royal children, both female and male, could very easily be learnt in these more relaxed surroundings. So Margaret, like her older brother and eventually her younger siblings, though only the 6 years younger Princess Mary survived, just 3 of them, Arthur, Margaret and Mary, survived into what we would call adulthood.
And Henry.
And Arthur was... And Henry, yes, Henry as well, of course, yes. And we tend to overlook him in this particular thing. But yes, Henry survived as well. And Margaret was brought up and educated as a future queen consort. That was her role from almost the moment she was born. I've always described, I think with some accuracy, royal princesses as marriage fodder, because that's what they were. They were, for better or worse, given at birth a role in life which would suit them to be on the throne or beside a male monarch and to handle all the aspects of female monarchy that were female being a female consort that were needed in those days. So Margaret learnt, of course, to be a very good horsewoman. She liked hunting. She was an excellent musician, as were all of the Tudors. I think, without exception, they were very musical and very capable as well, and could play a variety of instruments. She learnt French, as again all women and men of good birth were supposed to in those days, because much to the surprise sometimes of audiences and listeners, I find that people are astonished that the world did not speak or admire English as a language in the late 15th and 16th century. So if you wanted to play your part culturally in the wider environment, you needed to learn another language. She must have known some Latin. We don't know how good her Latin was. We know that she was literate and could write. I mean, people have been very rude about Margaret's handwriting in the past, but actually, compared to some, I didn't find it that difficult to read. It's sort of large and loopy, but you can certainly get the gist of it. She would have learnt dancing, of course, embroidery. She was a good archer as well, which was a sport that was deemed necessary for noble ladies in those days. So she had all the training and attributes that would be necessary to make her attractive on the marriage market. And it was a pleasant childhood with frequent visits from Queen Elizabeth, whom all the children adored. I mean, I think, like many others, I've always thought that Henry VIII never really got over the death of his mother when he was 10 or 11, and spent the rest of his life looking for a replacement, with horrendous implications for some of them, at any rate. But Margaret was his elder by about a year and a half. And eventually, of course, it became her destiny to fulfill the role of a queen consort by marrying King James IV of Scotland.
I actually used to live near Eltham, and what's always struck me is how close to Greenwich it was. And of course, Greenwich was one of the major royal palaces.
Yes, it was.
So did they put the children in Eltham so that they were close by when they were at Greenwich?
I think it was just that it was convenient for where the court might be. But yes, I would imagine that was a major aspect of it. It was a palace with beautiful grounds and plenty of fresh air and everything. And I mean, it's still, I think, very fine to visit, because the Great Hall is still visible, but it's the only thing from that period. The rest of it is Art Deco, which is fine, but it's not, it's not as it was. But yes, I think you could be right about that. It was a very handy place because the children were required to attend sometimes major affairs of state, visiting dignitaries, ambassadors, because part of their role was to be shown off.
Yes.
That they had to be seen. You didn't want someone thinking, oh, well, we never see this girl at court. Has she got, one eye and half a leg or something? So she wouldn't be a suitable consort for our king. But yes, the most notable event, of course, of when Henry, Margaret and Mary turned up at court, the biggest thing of all, I suppose, in their childhood, was the marriage of Prince Arthur to Catherine of Aragon. And there are these well-known stories that Margaret and Henry danced at one of the feasts afterwards, to show off not just their pleasure in their brother's marriage, but their own skills.
Yes, marriage ability.
What about her grandmother? I'm assuming she was named for her grandmother, Margaret Beaufort.
Yes, she was, Derek. Yes, and the grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, a formidable woman, as we know, in her own right. I think, in some respects, Margaret Beaufort is this sort of, you might disagree with this, Sharon, the epitome of what a late medieval woman could achieve.
Oh yes, definitely.
From not a very promising background. I mean, it was royal, but kind of on the wrong side almost, and she'd had a very, very difficult time as a girl and a young woman. But yes, Margaret Beaufort did play quite an important role, particularly after the very sad death of Elizabeth of York in 1503, when Margaret, who was then in limbo, she was married by proxy to James IV, but she hadn't gone up to Scotland yet. And her mother had been training her in, how to manage a royal household, what to expect and support in ladies of waiting, trying to find them marriages and all this kind of thing. And when Elizabeth died in February 1503, Margaret stepped in essentially to take over that role in the last sort of 6 months of Margaret's training before she left to Scotland. And it was from Margaret's house on the Northamptonshire, Lincolnshire borders that Margaret finally took farewell of her father in July 1503. So yes, Margaret Beaufort was an important influence. I mean, Margaret's upbringing, as one would expect for a royal princess, was primarily led by women. Now, of course, the tutors were all men.
Yeah.
So she's going to marry. Well, she does marry James IV. How significant for the Tudors was that marriage?
Well, it was significant because it was hoped, and there wasn't more hope than expectation, I think, that it would end the very difficult period of border warfare, which was endemic. It went on into the very end of Elizabeth's reign, of course. But Henry VII, I think, was particularly keen to try and come to some accommodation with James IV, who had been a thorn in his side for quite a while, a young, energetic king, keen to ride with his army in raids and things like that. And he'd also supported Perkin Warbeck, of course, and even married him off to a very distant cousin. I've never thought that James, I mean, all right, it was a credulous age in many respects. James wasn't that credulous a man. I don't think he ever thought Perkin Warbeck was the real thing, but it enabled him to really goad Henry VII, and almost, put him in a position where he could strike some sort of peace deal with him, not exactly entirely on his own terms, but with much greater force than he might otherwise have done. And Henry, of course, as you know, was not a king who particularly liked fighting foreign wars. And he wanted peace on the border. And Margaret's name was in the frame as a possible queen consort for James, who he was nearly 30 when they married, was still one of the most eligible bachelors in Europe. All right, Scotland was a small kingdom. It had a tiny population in comparison with England. I mean, Edinburgh was a city of about, at the most, 10 to 11,000 people, and Glasgow, which of course now is a major city, had just about 3,000. It was tiny in comparison. But James saw the advantages of peace. Margaret had been, as I said, a name in the frame as a possible wife for him for quite a while. He tried Ferdinand and Isabella, and they'd said they're terribly sorry, but we've run out of daughters for you to marry. And here is where we can link in Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth again, I think, as the concerned mother and grandmother of this very young girl. And Henry actually wrote, of course, to James IV, saying essentially, I'm not able to send my daughter to you at the moment because she's too young. And he actually said to other people, he was afraid that his wife and mother-in-law had expressed the view that the Scottish king might hurt her, which is a euphemism which we can possibly all understand. And so Margaret was actually 13 when she married. She was within a few months of her 14th birthday, but she'd been married by proxy in 1502, so that in the year 1501 to 1502, Henry VII had arranged excellent marriages for both of his two elder children, and Henry was too young, of course, as was Mary at that time. So it was a marriage a long time in the making, with political advantages to both sides. It's very interesting that even at this early stage, you have Henry's counsellors saying, hang on a minute, could there not possibly be a situation in which the descendants of this couple might inherit the English throne? And this is viewed as extremely far-fetched, of course. I mean, even in an age when people did die unexpectedly, particularly young, but at almost any age. But it was, as Henry said, well, even if this does happen, essentially England will take over Scotland, which wouldn't have gone down well with James IV. And in fact, of course, didn't happen in the full political sense until 1707. So it was a long way off. But yes, those were the sort of political imperatives behind it. So Margaret, who had long been in the box for this particular role, married James by proxy in the early winter of 1502 and was expected to go up to Scotland within a year or so of that. But she didn't do so, of course. It was 18 months. She didn't go as early as was expected because of her mother's death and the need to arrange a different household and just sort of get things in place for her before she left. But she did leave, and she left Richmond in late June of 1503, accompanying her father to Margaret Beaufort's home in the Midlands. And from there, she took a very sad leave. I'm sure it was very dignified, because Margaret had been brought up, you don't start blubbing in public under those circumstances. You just don't do it. But she must have known that she would probably never see him again. And he gave her a prayer book asking her to remember him as her loving father in her prayers.
Oh.
So it is quite, these are, as you know, Sharon, and I mean, it goes back way even further into the mists of time, even beyond the early medieval period. These are these tiny nuggets which make these people human to us, I think, and cross the centuries, and that, and something I might talk about in a minute about Margaret's early time in Scotland. These do make them so much more approachable to us, I think.
I think they do, because we don't have their own words most of the time. We do when we get into the Tudors, but in medieval times, you don't have the thoughts and feelings or the words of the women, so you have to read into the gifts that they get and the things that they send home, and the fact that they sometimes see relatives again, and just imagining how you'd feel if you saw your mum again after being away for 15-20 years. So it's things like that, these little nuggets, they make them human rather than just people in a book.
You don't really get the feelings of the men either, actually.
No, to be fair, no,
that's perfectly true.
You get the actions, but not the things, as you said, that make them appear human to us.
You do find it a bit more in the 17th century. I mean, some of Charles II's letters, particularly ones concerning the dreaded Lady Castlemaine, obviously have a personal aspect to them, and so do Oliver Cromwell's letters to his wife. But it's more the exception than the rule. And of course, most people put down on paper something that had an agenda behind it in those days, and wasn't necessarily their own view, and they wanted it to be seen by posterity in a certain way. So it does lack that personal touch. It's very hard to find, but no, we do find it in connection with Henry and Margaret, and with the very poignant letter she wrote back to him when shortly after her marriage in Scotland, when she had, as you probably know, this magnificent progress when we were up to Scotland. We always focus on the progresses of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, but this one, coming so early in the 16th century, is often overlooked, and was probably more magnificent than anything that they'd done. Literally about 300 people accompanied Margaret, including Sir Thomas Boleyn, interestingly enough, before the name Boleyn became very well known. She was under the most unwelcome supervision of the crusty old Earl of Surrey, who clearly resented having to look after this little girl. As he took her north, was rude to her servants, continually overlooked what she wanted. And when she got to Scotland and was finally married, spent all his time hogging the attention of her new husband. And I mean, Margaret had been well enough trained to know that those early days and weeks were crucial, and that it afforded her some opportunity to spend time with James without having some bloody English earl constantly sort of knee thumping and back slapping about military things. She does write to her father this extraordinary, I mean, the letter was mostly in a scribal hand, so it had been dictated to a secretary. And just a point I didn't make before, and I think is seldom made. All of these women, they could write, and they would often write postscripts, but they had to dictate letters. And as I found out years and years ago when I worked in the corporate world, dictation is actually something of an art to do it effectively. And that was something that they'd also been educated to do. And I think it's a part of their education that's almost completely overlooked. But Margaret had dictated to a secretary, a letter saying that she was concerned about how things were going in Scotland initially, that she wasn't getting enough time with her husband. And she writes at the end of it, "No more to your grace at this time, but I wish I were with you now and many times more."
Oh,
And I mean, this is a homesick
yeah,
13-year-old
yeah.
suddenly thrust into the role of Queen Consort. All right, it's a small country, but it's one that is beginning to punch above its weight in the European Renaissance. And James had for a monarch of a small and not very wealthy country a very glittering court. So Margaret was not, I don't think she would have felt that she was missing out on anything in London in that respect, but that she was missing out on establish a relationship which was to characterize, she hoped, the rest of her life.
Like we said about, we don't get an awful lot of the personal from these women just because of the way that they're written about, but and I do remember the number of times I've written, it was a happy marriage because they had so many children, they spent a lot of time together. So they must have been a happy marriage. And that's usually the indicator. How many children did they have? Well, they were happy then. Because basically they weren't trying to avoid each other all the time. But was James's and Margaret's a happy marriage? Did it change when Henry VIII came to the throne?
The answer to that is yes, but the marriage actually became closer after Henry VIII came to the throne, because there had always been these hints of sibling rivalry between Henry VIII and his elder sister. While she was, even though it was a proxy marriage, she was known as Queen of Scots, and she took precedence over him for a while. And the general view is, I think it was reported by one or two ambassadors, and you never be certain how reliable these reports are. But it was reported that he'd resented this. And knowing Henry, it seems quite likely, doesn't it? I mean, one could easily imagine it. But no, I mean, who knows what constitutes a happy marriage? I mean, I've been married for more than 50 years. And yes, I think in the broadest sense of the term, it was a happy marriage. I mean, clearly, you had initially a 13-year-old married to a man of nearly 30, who was a notorious philanderer, who had at least, I'm trying to think how many he had by then, certainly 4 illegitimate children. There had been more scattered around. And the bairns, as they were known, were at the time in Margaret's dower castle of Stirling, and they were removed from there fairly speedily, whether at Margaret's behest or because it was just thought more politic, I don't know. And in fact, they returned again after a while, but she had an inbuilt family in that respect, and she actually got on very well with James's illegitimate children, particularly his eldest son, Alexander, who would, of course, die with him on the battlefield of Flodden. And Margaret knew from her mother and grandmother what was needed to be done to establish the Queen's side of the court. And James needed this. You needed to have a queen and her ladies to give you the kind of cultural acceptability, if you like, in Europe and in dealing with other countries. And certainly James trained Margaret to be the Queen Consort that he wanted her to be, because in that respect, from his perspective, she was a blank canvas. And so she was soon undertaking with him the sort of religious duties that went with queenship, like very similar ceremonies, like, for example, in Maundy Thursday in Scotland to what there were in England. Traveling a lot. The Stuarts were a very visible and touchy-feely monarchy. I mean, when James travelled, which he did very widely because he was a great traveller, when he went out and about, he did meet people and they could actually touch him, and the saddle of the horse that he was on and all that. So one could imagine Henry kicking them in the guts and riding off like mad, Henry VIII. He was not a touchy-feely king at all, and had great fear of being too close to ordinary people, but it was part and parcel of the Stuart monarchy. So as soon as they were married, James took Margaret off around southwest Scotland to see some of her dower lands and all that sort of thing. Thereafter, interestingly enough, he pushed off up to northeast Scotland to Darnaway to visit his mistress. At the time, she'd been his mistress for a number of years, Janet Kennedy, who was expecting their third child. Now, you can ask yourself at this stage, how much does this 13-year-old newly arrived in Scotland know about all of this? And I suppose that we can never be certain of the answer, but I think, given the fact that ladies in waiting were there to kind of apprise you of how such things took place in real life, and the fact that Margaret would have been briefed about many things to do with her husband, I don't think she would have been entirely surprised. And of course, she was concentrating on establishing herself in Edinburgh, and it was accustomed for a king to travel. I don't suppose he said to her, look, sweetie, I'm just off now to see my mistress. She's about to pop out another one. But I think these things were more tolerated than we might suppose. I mean, the marriage did work. James's philandering calmed down a bit after the marriage. He was an indulgent and affectionate husband. He showered her with clothes and jewels and furs, and he'd spent a fortune on Holyrood Palace, establishing a queen's side there, because of course there hadn't been a queen consort in Scotland since his own mother, Margaret of Denmark, died some years, 15 or more years previously. And so he'd spent well beyond his means, and it was still not finished. I mean, I think we tend to assume when we visit these palaces nowadays that they've always looked like that.
Yes.
They haven't, and a lot of them were actual building sites or at least in part for much of the time that they were inhabited. So Margaret's side wasn't finished, but he'd spent a lot of work on. He'd done a lot of work on Stirling. And he'd also done a lot of work on Linlithgow, which became Margaret's favourite of her dower palaces, and incidentally where her granddaughter Mary Queen of Scots was born some years later. So Margaret became, of course, overnight a wealthy landowner in Scotland, so long as she could collect her rents. And we might get to that point later on, because it becomes quite crucial after James IV's death. And yes, I think they did. And again, this is something I'd like to emphasize in this sort of ongoing sibling rivalry between Henry VIII and his elder sister Margaret. There was a rivalry all during this period, once Henry became king, Henry VIII, as to who could produce not just an heir, a male heir, but a living child, one that would survive. And James and Margaret lost at least 4, possibly 5 children, I can't remember exactly, until James V was born in 1512. Her first child, I mean, James did show some restraint, James IV, in a manner which would have pleased his former mother-in-law had she been alive, and also Margaret Beaufort. He obviously used some restraint, because Margaret didn't become pregnant until she was 16 and gave birth in the beginning of 1507. Obviously, the marriage must have been consummated, at least enough to meet sort of canon law and all that kind of thing at the time. But he clearly showed restraint in trying to get her pregnant. And when she did give birth, it was to a son, which was, precisely what the queen was supposed to do. She had fulfilled her duty. She seems to have had a reasonably okay pregnancy, and unlike in England, Scottish queens didn't have to take to their chamber. She was still quite visible until very late in the pregnancy, and literally a number of days before she gave birth to this other Prince James. James, her husband, sent her a singer from London and a lutenist and all that to entertain her. So, I mean, these are nice little touches that you can see in him. I mean, I'm a great fan of James IV. I mean, normally I find the fact that people get so invested in figures in the past rather strange, even though I'm a historian I find them interesting, but I can't
Yeah.
get invested. But James IV, I would genuinely like to meet, though not if I had a dental problem, because he, as you know, he was a very keen amateur dentist. So I think most of his nobles always went to court with their teeth in excellent condition, hopefully.
Yeah, or kept their mouths closed.
Their mouths yes, extremely so. So Margaret gave birth in early 1507. It was a son. He was named Prince James. The king was overjoyed. The queen was very ill afterwards. She may have had puerperal fever, which of course was a great killer of women. James actually went and visited a shrine to pray for her recovery, but she did recover. And in nearly all the pregnancies she had subsequently, she seems to have had a difficult time afterwards. But she did recover. And the little prince, if you look at the treasurer's accounts, you can see that they got, hugely expensive bedding for him, decorated cradles, a little red satin coat, and he died at the age of about 1. We don't know why. Obviously, the parents were bereft. I mean, people always assume, or used to assume, I think times have changed a bit on this, that people in those days had so many children that, like you were saying, Sharon, it must have been a happy marriage, which is not the same at all. I mean, if you look at Catherine de' Medici and Henry II in France, they had numerous children and didn't have anything remotely approaching a happy marriage. And this couple in Scotland, I think I think it would be stupid to say they were ever madly in love. That would have been considered rather odd for a royal couple in those days, and perhaps slightly unseemly almost. But I think there was a great deal of affection and respect, and it grew, particularly after Henry VIII became king and he refused to pay the rest of Margaret's dowry. He wouldn't pay her the monies and goods that she'd been left in either her father's or her brother Arthur's will. He was a young whippersnapper determined to sort of remind the Scots that they were basically a subject people. This didn't go down very well with James IV, and as you know, relations deteriorated. But as the political situation deteriorated, Margaret became ever more a sort of staunch ally of her husband, and she wrote in furious letters to her brother, essentially saying, "What do you mean by, insulting my husband in this way? Our husband is ever the better to us," she wrote. So she was a staunch ally. What she thought of his invasion of England in 1513, which ended in disaster, of course, has been the subject of a lot of historical novels and speculation and much later accounts. But certainly she would not have opposed it and didn't do so, even if she had misgivings about it. So yes, I think it was, by the standards of the time, as a royal marriage, a happy one, with quite a lot of sadness underlying it, because they lost child after child. And Margaret went on a pilgrimage of her own in the year before, up towards Aberdeen, before the eventual James V was born. And when he was born, he was quite a sickly child. But he survived, and as we all know, you only need one healthy male heir to survive. And at the time, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon did not have a living child. And when they did, it was several years later, and it was a girl. So
you said one of the reasons for the marriage at all, really, from Henry VII's point of view, was to end this period of warfare and unrest in the north with Scotland. But obviously, from what you've just said, didn't really work out that way. Was that down to James IV just wanting to show independence and sort of pushing at England, or were there other reasons why peace didn't come?
Well, peace actually broke down, of course, because of finally, because of the wider European scene. I mean, I think there had been, for a while, there was a lull in cross-border raiding and reaving and all that kind of thing. I mean, it's still quite a wild part of the British Isles there, perhaps not quite as wild as the far north of Scotland, but it's, if you go to the borders and visit Hermitage Castle, which was one of the Bothwell later on his properties, I mean, these are not cozy country homes.
No.
They are fortified and meant to be defended. And I think there was such a long history of cross-border raiding, because it wasn't just the Scots coming south, it was also
No.
English going north. And yet, of course, they had their own system of courts in which they heard grievances and cases in which there was a Scottish presence and an English presence. So it has almost like a life and culture of its own. As far as cross-border raiding was concerned, I think it did kind of die off in the early years of the marriage, and probably picked up again from time to time. But what finally put an end to the rather hopefully named Treaty of Perpetual Peace of 1503 was the international situation, when Henry VIII, I mean, Henry had been making bellicose noises towards Scotland for a while because he was that kind of person, and he had begun this kind of personal feud with James IV and to a lesser degree with his own sister over what was owed to Margaret and things of that sort. But it was the war in France in 1513. I find it difficult to represent Henry as being some kind of foreign policy genius, because I don't think he was. I think he was pretty much a disaster, actually. And this was an early sign of it. He was drawn into this by his father-in-law, Ferdinand of Aragon, who quite soon, interestingly enough, dropped out of it altogether. And by the Emperor Maximilian. They were concerned about the Italian ambitions, of course, of Louis XII, because French monarchs at that time did have ambitions in Italy. And they decided to fight Louis XII. Now, Louis XII would have been completely isolated were it not for the old alliance between Scotland and France. And essentially, Louis XII called in a favour. What he wanted was James's navy. And James sent a couple of leading nobles over and some ships, but most of the navy never even got there and wasn't used. It wasn't a naval warfare at all. But James also saw this as an opportunity to invade northern England, while his brother-in-law was otherwise engaged chasing a few French horsemen, because that is literally all that happened while Henry VIII was in France during that time. While Henry VIII was otherwise engaged in sort of trying to boost his ego in France, James took the opportunity to invade northern England. And he came south over the border in August 1503 with a huge host. I mean, its numbers may have been slightly over-egged, but it was given as about 30 to 40,000 men. It was certainly closer to 30,000 and may have even been somewhat fewer than that. And took a few forts and castles in Northumberland. But actually, he didn't get very far south at all. His aim, I think, and so do most other historians knowledgeable about Scottish history at this period, was perhaps, if he could, to get as far as York and there establish some kind of northern kingdom. And of course, he had this interesting possibility, and reality, in fact, in the back of his mind. Henry was off in France. What happened if he was killed in battle there? He had no heir. Well, except for James's wife. Margaret Tudor was Henry's heir, something which didn't sit well with Henry either. And he could essentially rule both kingdoms through her. So it's not such a daft thing to do. It's not just, James sort of cosplaying at being a great late medieval warrior. It has quite sound political and military aspects to it. But of course, what he hadn't counted on, what actually happened, of course, as far as Flodden is a misnomer, as you know. It was actually, the battle was fought on Branxton Hill, which is somewhat to one side of Flodden Field itself. James established himself on this remote hillside in northeastern Northumberland, and Surrey, who of course had brought him his bride 10 years before, tried to goad him into giving battle, and eventually moved his own much smaller force at night so that James was compelled to leave Flodden to go to Branxton without having properly done an assessment of what the ground was actually like. And eventually on September the 9th, of course, with these, James had divided his army into these separate battles, as the different contingents of it were known in those days, with himself at the head of one of them. And the Scots descended this huge host in down this sodden hill, because it had been pouring with rain for days and was actually blowing quite a strong wind. The Scots came down barefooted to get better grip on the muddy surface. They had these great guns behind them, because James was hugely into technology. A lot of these kings were, and he wanted all the latest soldiering ideas and technology. He'd got gunners from Switzerland and France and Germany and wherever. But what none of these people were able to do anything about was that the bottom of Branxton Hill had become a quagmire. And you couldn't see that from the top. And James had not been able to scout sufficiently. And his pike carrying soldiers, and a pike is not a wieldy instrument in face-to-face fighting, were drawn down into this. And after the first battle under Lord Hume appeared to have been quite successful and sort of retired to another part of the field, the others came down and were drawn into this quagmire and were cut down by the English bill, which is a hedging implement, but short and deadly. And the Scots were cut down in their thousands. And James IV himself died, probably trying to get to hand-to-hand combat with Surrey. But he died on the field there with his son, his illegitimate son, Alexander, the Archbishop of St Andrews, and much of the flower of the Scottish nobility and church, incidentally, because churchmen fought in those days. But well, that won't come as any surprise to you two, because they fought in medieval times as well. And Margaret was left a widow, pregnant at the age of 23 with another child.
And it must have been devastating for her.
It must have, Sharon, yes. I mean, there were all these reports about her screaming hysterically, and that she'd spent, the intervening days after he'd left, sitting on the tower of Linlithgow Palace. But I see this is just fanciful. Margaret had a bit of a temper, but she would have known how to behave in those circumstances. She must have been devastated, but of course the English were not going to invade. They didn't have the manpower. This was something that would haunt Henry VIII and others afterwards for years. It's all very well to fight people. I mean, well, one could make certain modern comparisons with all of this.
Yes,
you can fight, but if you can't actually invade and occupy, then you're probably not going to win. The news got back to Edinburgh probably within 24 hours. How soon Margaret knew it at Linlithgow, we don't quite know. She immediately, however, moved herself, James V, as he was, the little boy was then, to Stirling, because it was safer, and summoned a council. And she had been named by James. And again, I think this is another, Margaret, as you've asked in one of the questions further on, is often viewed as a foolish woman out of her depth. But if she was really that foolish, I don't think James IV would have left her as regent, or tutrix, as the official term was then. He had sufficient confidence in her that she could handle this kind of situation. But he had made the one stipulation, which was to come back and haunt Margaret, and that was that she wasn't to remarry, because he foresaw if she remarried a European monarch, she would have to leave Scotland. If she remarried within Scotland, there would probably be the devil to pay amongst the Scottish noblemen, who were not always as fractious as they're sometimes made out to be, but would undoubtedly, there would have been, and indeed was when it happened, a great deal of ill feeling.
Yeah.
But Margaret, of course, was pregnant throughout the time of her first regency, and attended council meetings as often as she could, but towards the end obviously didn't. And she gave birth to Alexander, Duke of Ross, her last child with James IV, at the end of April 1514. and then took a while to get back into the swing of things politically. And at some point during that time, we don't know how they met or under what circumstances. She was probably pushed, if not, coerced, but certainly actively encouraged to marry again to Archibald Douglas, who was the Earl of Angus and who happened to be the grandson of the keeper of Stirling Castle. And we don't know how they met. We don't know whether they'd even known each other before this. They were of the same age, just about. They were both widowed. He'd lost his first wife, Mary Hebburn, probably in childbirth the year before, which might explain why he wasn't at Flodden. I mean, I've never seen any kind of explanation or even much sort of discussion of why Angus wasn't at Flodden, but he wasn't. And so he was a prominent Scottish nobleman with very little political experience. He didn't actually join the council until about the time that Margaret gave birth in the April of 1514. He wasn't a toy boy, and it's very unlikely that Margaret was madly in love with him. I really don't accept that at all. She barely knew him. We don't even know how they managed to get from Stirling to down near Perth to Kinnoul, where they were secretly married in August of 1514 without anyone knowing. And I suppose if you put yourself in Margaret's situation, she wasn't confident that the Scottish lords would continue to back her. Her situation, I think, was always, and I've used this in the title of a number of talks I've given, that she was neither a Tudor nor a Stuart. By that time in England, she would have been viewed as either someone that Henry VIII could just tell what to do, or someone that he didn't entirely trust. I mean, he tried both, as we know, with no very great success in either. And the Scottish lords had hummed and hawed. Many had said, and not that long before she married again, actually, that they were, quite willing to serve your grace, blah, blah. But they were also in contact with John Stuart, Duke of Albany, who'd been born and brought up in France and was the son of a recalcitrant brother of James III of Scotland. Margaret lived for a difficult year, first with pregnancy, then with childbirth, in the uncertainty as to how long she could hold on to her position. She eventually decided, whether for good or for ill, no doubt because the Douglas contingency saw this as greatly to their advantage, to take the plunge and marry Angus. I think it was more a case of trying to buoy up her position than falling madly in love with someone years younger than her. Well, for a start, he wasn't years younger than her. And given what happened to their marriage, it seems to me unlikely that she had any romantic illusions when she married him. And he was not, of course, the witless young fool that an uncle had described him as. Quite the reverse. He's an important figure in 16th century Scottish politics, and to a lesser degree in England as well. So, of course, that brought an end to her regency. She had broken the terms of it. She still for a while retained hold of the children, but not for long. The Scots did bring over Albany, who tried his best in 3 different periods of time in Scotland to bring these people to heel, and didn't succeed. And meanwhile, of course, Margaret's situation grew more parlous. Eventually, her sons were taken away from her. There's the famous Victorian painting of her outside the gates of Stirling Castle telling the Scottish lords to get lost, basically. But Margaret was a woman of considerable bravery. She had all this flair for occasion and oratory that the Tudors had as well. She was an inveterate letter writer, as you know. I mean, more of her letters survive than most other Tudor monarchs. So the period of James V's minority is one of the most confusing in all of Scottish history. And I'm not sure, even after years of reading about it, that I fully understand it. And of course, in writing about Margaret, you don't need to go into chapter and verse. It would bore people rigid. But perhaps all you really need to know is that by 1525, Angus had won the support of Henry VIII, who consistently refused to support his sister, and hadn't helped her position by early on suggesting but he might kidnap her 2 sons and bring them to England to be educated, which, as you can probably understand, doesn't go down well with the Scottish nobility.
No.
And it sort of casts Henry VIII into an almost Richard III wicked uncle role. So Margaret did have a second period of regency briefly in 1525, when a situation was brought in that James V was perhaps legally of age to rule, but he would need council to support him, and the role of his, chief counsellor would rotate on a quarterly basis. Well, stupidly, they assigned this role to Angus, who speedily decided that he wasn't going to give it up at the end of a few months and held on to it. And by that time, Margaret's sort of period as regent she'd had to give it up. The forces against her were really just too strong. And she didn't have enough time to establish herself. And also the men who did support her, that the Hamilton family, of course, who were the next in line to the Scottish throne after James V, their support ebbed and flowed. I mean, it's very difficult for a woman, I think, a queen consort, by that time a dowager queen in Scotland, to make your way through this morass of different families with shifting interests, and they can't be relied upon to be consistent. At one point they'll gang up against each other, at another point they'll all be very friendly. I mean, how on earth you deal with that? Well, even Angus couldn't deal with it in the end, of course. And a few years later, in 1528, James V managed to escape, in inverted commas, from what had essentially been a form of custody. I mean, he hated the Douglases with a passion, and with good reason, and established himself in Stirling Castle, where his mother, and by that time her third husband, because Margaret had divorced Angus, and then the marriage went rapidly downhill. She fled from Scotland in 1515 when pregnant with her last child, Lady Margaret Douglas, and there is a lady worth talking about as well.
Yes.
No, she's not medieval, but by God, she was a force to be reckoned with in Elizabethan England. Margaret had fled from Linlithgow. She'd gone first of all to the stronghold on the coast of Scotland, and then gone over the border, and ignominiously had to return because she hadn't got Henry VIII's permission to enter England. So she ended up back with some nuns in Coldstream, and then she was given permission, and she made it as far as Harbottle Castle in Northumberland, which wasn't really again, it was more of a border fortress than a luxurious castle, where she gave birth to Lady Margaret Douglas in November 1515. Again, it was another horrendous pregnancy. But I mean, let's face it, Sharon, if you and I had to ride side saddle while 8.5 months pregnant, we'd probably not feel too good afterwards. I mean, we tend to overlook these things that these women had to do.
Yeah.
We just don't think about it. And it's all very well to describe someone afterwards who was unwell as a whinger. I mean, what would you have done?
The thing is, once you're about 6 months pregnant, that's it. You don't want to have to, you feel like you're a whale. You don't want to have to cross borders. And
no, and certainly not riding side saddle. I mean, I suppose riding normally would have been even more difficult in a way. At least side saddle shifts the weight to some degree. But I mean, yes, it was a horrendous experience. And she also suffered afterwards very badly from sciatica. And as someone who has had sciatica herself, I can only sympathise, because the pain is awful. And again, at this period, of course, she had nothing. She had fled from Scotland with the clothes that she was wearing, and possibly a very few items of her very extensive, as you can imagine, jewellery collection, and wound up in northern Scotland, eventually in northern England. Eventually, she, of course, was Lord Dacre and his wife took her in farther south in Northumberland, in a much more luxurious castle where she spent Christmas. And Henry and Catherine sent a layette for the new baby girl, whom Margaret announced as giving birth to as a Christian soul, being a young lady. I'm not sure that Margaret Douglas was always terribly ladylike as life went on, but she was her mother's last child and her only surviving daughter. There'd been a couple of daughters with James the Fourth, but they had not survived birth by more than, a matter of hours or days. And so Margaret finally has a daughter, and born in England, which is interesting for the succession problem later on under Elizabeth I, because James V had not been born in England, but his half-sister was. And that strengthened her claim to the English throne, of course. And when she went back to Scotland, when James V finally shook off the Douglases, Margaret Douglas was brought up as a princess, basically, but her father reclaimed her when she was about 13 and took her to France with him and then to England. Because, again, one of the things that's worth remembering about Margaret, I think, is that she's often criticised, particularly at this point when she's just gone over the border, for being more interested in the wardrobe of nice new clothes that Henry VIII had sent her. But of course she didn't have anything else to wear. What are you supposed to do? And Margaret always had this image of herself as a queen. She'd been brought up to think of herself that way. She knew how a queen should dress and look. And it's just, I think, Victorian foolishness, which has kind of carried on well in longer than it should have done.
I love blaming the Victorians, Linda.
Well, we always love blaming the Victorians.
That somehow this is the activity of a foolish and shallow woman. I mean, for God's sake, if you want your son to remember you as a queen, you don't want to look as though you've just been to the charity shop.
Now, and you also look at Elizabeth I. She was the queen of being able to portray herself as a queen with her clothes and jewels.
Yes, but she doesn't get criticised for
it.
No, so I think it's grossly unfair. And Margaret I don't think she was always quite as impoverished as she made herself out to be. I mean, it was the custom in the 16th century to represent yourself as having no money. I don't quite know why, whether it was considered unseemly, whether you were always hoping for a bit more. It may have been that cash flow as such was always a bit difficult. Margaret's money, or her income, as it were, lay in the rents which she was supposed to collect from her lands. But when she married, first of all, Archibald Douglas, and then later on Henry Stuart, who was one of these literally hundreds of Stuarts vaguely connected to the royal family. You have to remember, you can be a queen, you can dress as one, you can look as one, but you are subservient to your husband because you're a woman. And they both helped themselves to her rents and sold off some of her land without her knowledge. And Margaret, being Margaret, went to court to try and retrieve this, and has been criticised for that as well. I mean, she wasn't the sort of woman who would just sit down and shut up, and why should she? At one stage she claimed she didn't have enough money to pay her servants. This is a day-to-day reality. And I think she handled it with, well, a determination which you can hardly fault. I'm not suggesting that she was a sweet and lovable little thing. I don't think in many respects she was a very likable woman, but, circumstances had forced her into that kind of situation, plus which she's a Tudor. And, they do have high opinion of themselves, as we know.
Yeah.
So I think the negative image of her, which before I wrote my book, a number of people had sort of started to suggest this, but many, including female historians, had fallen for this. There's an actual biography of her which came out, I think, in the 1990s by an American academic, published by the University of Edinburgh Press, in which it describes her marriage to Angus as a moment of womanly weakness. I don't think my editor would let me do that. I mean, I would never write it anyhow, but, it does show how times have changed, I think, in assessing these women and looking really in detail at what their lives were like. Because there's a hell of a lot of material about Margaret.
Yeah.
And it isn't really until an academic in 2017, I think, her first name's Helen, and for the life of me, I can't at the moment remember her second, but it's in my book somewhere. And she's actually a linguist, an English language linguist. She looked at Margaret's letters from the point of view of how they were written and what sort of what kind of letter they were. Were they scribal? Were they actually holograph letters she'd written herself? Were they memorials, which is this rather wonderful idea in which it's a bit like acting almost. You brief a trusted servant with what you've written and what points you want them to put over. And then in Margaret's case, she'd sent them off down to London to speak to her brother or to Wolsey. And of course, much depends on how the deliverer of the memorial reads the reactions that he's getting. And then he adapts what Margaret has said to fit the circumstances. I don't think any of this worked terribly well, but it's very interesting that Margaret was familiar enough and expert enough to use all these different types of communication, really. I mean, she couldn't fall back on Instagram after all. So she had to use one, and she used them very expertly. And she was used as a diplomat in the 1520s, even into the mid 1530s. I think her role as like that has also been greatly underplayed. We might, in the Victorian and early 20th century, have written her off as a foolish woman. And clearly her brother hadn't got much time for her, but he couldn't afford to ignore her completely, particularly when things were going wrong with France. So I think, and the period after James V finally threw off the yoke of the Douglases and ruled for himself after 1528, has Margaret's third marriage, which sadly I think was one that perhaps she had been infatuated. Henry Stuart was younger than her. He was about 6 years younger. Again, it's not a huge gap. Especially given the gaps that there often were in marriage ages in those days. But he was unfaithful and helped himself to her money and all that. And she tried to divorce him. And James V essentially said, look, Ma, enough. We're not going down this route. But Margaret did go back to court. She met both of her daughters-in-law. Madeline, obviously, very briefly, because Madeline was dead within 6 weeks of returning to Scotland with James V. Mary of Guise, she knew much better. And I think from her, Mary of Guise probably learnt an important lesson, which is whatever is happening around you, do hold on to your child. Don't let them go.
Yes.
Because even if in Mary of Guise's case, as she was later to do, you have to wait years, you will eventually perhaps get into power. And Margaret had, perhaps because of circumstances and because she was almost too fond a mother, and because she didn't really have enough cards on her side, she'd had to give up her sons. And I think if she'd remained unmarried, as Mary of Guise did, of course, as a widow, then she might have been in a stronger position in Scotland, and things could have been very different for her. I think Mary of Guise probably learnt that. The two women got on very well. Of course, Margaret would have spoken French, and eventually Mary of Guise must have learned some Scots. Margaret was fluent in Scots within sort of 4 or 5 years of leaving England and marrying there. And it seems to have been quite a warm relationship. And of course, in the terrible summer of 1541, James V and his wife, and theirs was not a particularly happy marriage, incidentally. James was much more of a philanderer than his father, even. He had numerous, I've discovered he had illegitimate children recently, even I didn't know about. And it was a passionless marriage. I mean, they both did their duty, and they did have 2 sons, James and Arthur, but they both died literally within a day of each other in the summer of 1541, leaving their parents utterly bereft. And Margaret played a huge role in comforting them and trying to get them through this period, which I think was very valuable and shows her ongoing commitment to Scotland and to the Stuart dynasty. Because the one thing I think I'd like your listeners to remember, Derek and Sharon, is that Margaret Tudor, above all else, whatever her failings, perhaps she wasn't the nicest woman, she was a dynast. She was a true Tudor dynast. And her one aim after her first husband died, even if she didn't set about it in perhaps the most effective manner, was to make sure that her son would reach adulthood and rule. And she achieved that. And of course, the other thing that she achieved, which I've always rather liked, is that, Henry clearly came more and more to view her as a nuisance and perhaps actively dislike her, Henry VIII. But it is her line that sits on the throne of the United Kingdom to this day. And to that degree, she is perhaps the great survivor of the Tudor period, although she died in her early 50s in Methven Castle outside Perth of a stroke. Her son was too far away in Falkland Palace. He couldn't get to her in time. Henry VIII sent a messenger north to see if she'd left a will, presumably hoping that there's something in it for him. She had not. And there wasn't even any mourning for her at Henry VIII's court, which I think is, well, it's just one of many things that one can dislike about Henry VIII. But that's Margaret for you.
I think that's been absolutely brilliant, a really succinct impression of her. And I think it's one of those things that we have to remember that, like you say, she's often described as foolish, but there was so much more to her. We often look at these women in 2D.
Exactly, yeah.
And she did learn from her experiences, and she had to adapt, because to lose your husband when you're only 20 yourself,
23,
and raise a child and face the Scottish nobility, and yes, she made some mistakes, but who hasn't?
Exactly. And should you be castigated down through the centuries for that? I don't think so. Which is why I think history is always changing and evolving, and that is the best thing for it. I suppose the one thing that disturbs me a bit, and probably disturbs you as well, that we do have this prevailing view of our past, which is based very much on the sort of Elizabethan nationalistic Protestant view of British, English history in those days, British until 1707, but and it really has warped our understanding of our past. Bloody Mary was Bloody Mary, and that was it. Elizabeth was good Queen Bess, and that was that. And I think you'd asked me just to finish up what I'm working on at the moment, which brings me to good Queen Bess, because I had as a girl, I thought Elizabeth was wonderful because, I swallowed all this stuff. And of course, in recent years, there's been a lot more scholarship done. I mean, there have always been people who dissed Elizabeth, but largely because, she was a Protestant queen, and that, for the wrong reasons, I think, not understanding her weaknesses really, but what they thought she represented. And there's been an awful lot of work done by John Guy and by other historians, particularly on the latter part of Elizabeth's reign. But what I'm looking at, as I'm not writing a biography of Elizabeth, she says, though perhaps that sort of underlines what it is, I'm writing about her suitors. I mean, this is not an entirely original topic, but the way I'm doing it is different. But I've got a lot of stuff from different archives in Europe, and the focus is meant to be, and I'm going to have to go back and do some editing, I think, on the men themselves, and not so much on her. But underlying it, I think, I will take a view which will no doubt upset Elizabeth's supporters greatly, though it shouldn't do really, because I think it casts her in a more human light almost. I've got to deliver it in just under a year, but I'm quite well advanced with it, but it's going to need a lot of work.
Thank you very much, Linda Porter, for joining us. It's been absolutely fascinating. And
thank you.
Well, thank you.
Oh, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for inviting me onto the podcast.
So a huge thank you to Dr. Linda Porter taking us into the life of Margaret Tudor. That was absolutely fascinating. Do join us next time when we will be joined by Peter Gibbons and looking into the career and reputation, I suppose, of one of history's bad boys, Edric Striona, and the early part of the 11th century, where we have Edric Striona, Thorkel the Tall, and Sweyn Forkbeard. Oh, and of course, Ethelred II, the Unready. So I'm looking forward to having a chat with Peter about the characters of the early 11th century and how bad Edric Striona really was. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. I hope you enjoyed the fascinating podcast from Linda Porter. Now, it'd be really good if you could give us some feedback on the Tudor ones we're doing, as well as our usual medieval podcast. And thanks for listening.